The relationship between Jews and Arabs in Ottoman Palestine is a topic of much interest, not only myself, but I know many of our viewers. On one hand, they say that, Jews were dhimmis, we weren't treated well, life was shit. On the other hand, we hear it was beautiful, it was perfect, life was beautiful. I'm guessing it was probably something in between. As with most things of the conflict, each side takes a little bit of an extreme approach and stretches the truth just a little bit. That would be my guess, but I know that in an hour from now, I'm going to be much more informed than I currently am. So I am interested in knowing from you. Just feel free to give a breakdown. What was life like? What were the dynamics between Jews and Arabs? When did it start going wrong?
Yeah, so I think first of all, what we need to do is try to erase the history that happens after 1917 Balfour Declaration, right? The Balfour Declaration hovers over us. It's a huge monumental moment where both the Palestinians and the Jewish communities transform leaps and bounds in different directions. That should be the first thing. Now, we can't go back and give a whole history of Jews under Islamic empires. But if we look at the Ottoman Empire in general, yes, Jews were considered dhimmis in Islam. Jews and Christians are people of the book. Muslim men can marry Jews and Christians. Of course, by Islam, the father defines who the religion. By Judaism, it's a mother. So we can, that later on we can even talk, because there was intermarriage between even Jews and Palestinians up until now there are. In fact, it's something that's consistent throughout history. Sometimes small numbers, sometimes larger numbers, different things like that. But let's go back to this question of the dhimmis or the protected minorities, or this idea that they were discriminated against because they're having to pay the jizya, the poll tax, right? What I try to point out to my students, friends, parties in New York, when you go to a party and you say you do Palestine, Israel, people jump up and say, "Oh wow, you must have a lot of controversy," and then I say no, and I start talking. But when this topic comes up, and often does, Jews were discriminated under Islam for so many years, and I say to them, let's remember that there was no notion of equality before the modern era, right? So Jews and Christians, yes, they were dhimmis, and yes, they had a poll tax, but Muslims weren't equal during this period, that time also. If you're a peasant, you're certainly not equal. You have no equality to someone that's in the city in terms of rights. In the U.S. you talk about obligations and rights, but obligations and rights transcends whether you're a city goer, if you're a muhtar, a village leader, you're not going to be equal with those peasants that are working. And I work later on. We can talk about. I work with documents that are petitions by peasants, by middle people, by urban people. So let's erase this idea that there was equality at all. But from all the way from the Tanzimat era to the 1880s, when there's the first constitution in the Ottoman Empire, the non-Muslims, already from 1856, defined in the 1869 citizenship law, non-Muslims were equal to Muslims in the Ottoman Empire. That whole dhimmi status disappears within the 19th century. And you do have something that is this sense of equality across the board. So from the 1860s, 1870s, Jews in the Ottoman Empire, whether they're in Palestine, whether they're in Syria, whether they're in the center of Istanbul, they're able to go to schools. Aside Muslims, they join the foreign department in the Ottoman government, and they're not subjected to their traditional roles, let's say per se, of translators or doctors in the palace or numerous artisans, different things like this, right? So we need to come back. Let's come back to the point that, yeah, there was no sense of equality. So equality for Jews within the Ottoman era is happening pretty much parallel to what's happening in Europe. Where France, with the French Revolution, to Russia, that offers them rights and retracts those rights later on in the 1880s. Okay, so the Ottoman or the Islamic the empire that we're talking about is not very, very different. What I will say, though, and then we can go back to maybe more questions, is that Jews were an integral fabric of the Ottoman Empire, meaning any major city, whether it's the holy city of Jerusalem, whether it's Cairo that was semi under Ottoman rule, especially Istanbul, Izmir, Damascus, Baghdad, all these cities that were classically Ottoman or Islamic, a major component was they always have to have Jews, Christians, and Muslims, right? That's so it's more than just sort of this cliche, they all live together happily. Yes, there were days where there were more difficult days, there were better days, right? But, if you go to Ortaköy in Istanbul today, you're going to see from the late 19th century a church, a mosque, and a synagogue juxtaposed to one another within a city square. But then if you go back to the 15th, 16th century, after the Ottoman rule in conquest of Istanbul, you'll have something very similar. A city square in Balat where you have a synagogue, a church, and a mosque. So they were a part of that integral fabric of Ottoman society. And then we can talk about what changes later on. But I think that's something very important to understand, that we often erase the history. I'll be talking a lot about erasing the history. And this is something that's been erased on account of people sometimes make cheap claims or claims they really believe that Jews were always discriminated against in the Ottoman lands, right? So I'll just end by saying there was no sense of equality. Jews and Christians did not do army service also. By 1909, they're being recruited to the army. Okay, so some very happily, some people not so happy. And of course, the very last sentence, I promise this will be last sentence 3 times now, the very last sentence is that for rabbis and for priests alike, often, this idea of equality didn't sit so well. So first of all, the poll tax that they're paying is not paid in, the Ottoman administrators don't knock on the door of every Jewish family and says, give us money. This is collected through the community, right? And the community will pay that certain tax. And it's often collected through kosher meat, purchase of kosher meat, the extra tax that is put there, and through that money that they pay. And by the late 19th century, Jews are also getting very upset that the monopolies on kosher meat, so which is very interesting for today's discussion also. I mean, this is something that's continuous, this monopoly over meat that makes it very, very expensive for Jews who do not have, the have-nots, to actually purchase meat because there is that extra tax on it at sometimes. Okay, but they don't go to the military. And by not going to military, that's something important. They're worried about the military. They're worried about kosher food in the army service. And most, coming back to rabbis and priests, they're worried that the more that they get equality, they're going to not be going to Talmud Torah to study the Torah, right? And they're not going to go to the family business, or they're not going to go become religious scholars, the head of the Bet Din, or they're not going to work in the Bet Din, they're not going to work in the synagogues, they're not going to work in the, so it's very parallel to the Islamic society, right? That they're not going to go to the madrasas, okay, and they're going to go to modern education. So it really is a complicated topic.